The moment the trailer rocked so hard that the metal hinges groaned, Margaret felt the first spark of fear crawl up her spine. She had spent 20 years raising miniature horses, the smallest and gentlest creatures she knew, and nothing on her farm had ever made a sound like that. She gripped the lead rope in her hand, frozen in the frost-dusted driveway, watching the huge livestock trailer sway again under the force of whatever was inside it. Her heartbeat kicked faster. This was supposed to be the quiet arrival of a tiny Palomino gelding, a calm companion for her 3 frightened rescue foals. But whatever was inside that trailer was far too big, far too strong, and far too wrong. Inside her barn, her miniature horses began calling out, their high whinnies sharp with confusion. Margaret took a slow step back as the driver lifted the latch on the trailer ramp. Her breath clouded in the cold morning air. She hadn't felt this nervous on her own farm in years. One small horse she could handle, even a nervous one. But this felt like a storm about to break. The ramp dropped with a heavy thud. Dust swirled. A deep, thunder-strong whinny rolled out of the trailer, echoing across her fields with a power that made her chest vibrate. Margaret's breath caught. No miniature horse on earth could make a sound like that. She wanted to shout for the driver to stop, to close the ramp, to double-check his paperwork. But her voice failed her as huge hooves clattered inside the trailer. And then she saw him. A massive Clydesdale gelding stepped backward into the morning light. His coat gleamed like polished mahogany. His 4 white socks flashed bright as snow. His mane fell thick across his neck, and the feathering around his ankles drifted with every movement. He was enormous, towering over Margaret like a living mountain. She had to tilt her chin nearly to the sky just to see his kind, intelligent eyes. Everything about this horse was wrong for her tiny rescue farm. Everything except the calm, gentle way he stood there, breathing slowly, waiting for direction, as if he already understood this place needed something soft. I can't take him, Margaret said, her voice shaking. He isn't mine. Please, check again. But the driver was already climbing back into his truck, eager to leave the mix-up behind. In his hand, he left her a clipboard and the lead rope attached to nearly a ton of horse she had never expected to meet. By the time the truck roared down the driveway, Margaret stood alone with the giant gelding. Her mind raced. Feed costs, space limitations, fencing, stall height. Everything on her farm was built for horses barely 3 feet tall. This draft horse could step over a fence without trying. He could knock down a gate just by leaning on it. Keeping him here wasn't just difficult, it felt impossible. Her other miniature horses called out again, louder this time, curious, nervous, confused. The Clydesdale lifted his head and pricked his ears toward the barn. He took a single step, and the lead rope tugged Margaret forward, as if she weighed nothing at all. She braced her boots in the gravel and held tight. "Easy, big fellow," she said, voice trembling. He stopped instantly, and in that single moment of obedience, something in her chest loosened. This horse wasn't wild, he wasn't dangerous, he was gentle, he was listening. And for reasons she did not yet understand, he trusted her. Inside the barn, her miniature horses pressed their tiny heads over their stall doors, staring at the giant stranger with wide eyes. The Clydesdale stretched his neck toward a little mare named Buttercup. She was no higher than his shoulders, fragile and round like a pony doll come to life. Margaret held her breath as their noses touched. One toss of his head could injure her. One wrong move could frighten her entire herd. But he lowered his head slowly, softly, carefully, as if he knew he had to adjust every movement for the tiny creatures watching him. Buttercup nickered in pure delight. Within seconds, every miniature horse leaned forward, eager to greet him. Margaret stood stunned. This giant, who could not fit in her stalls, who could drain her feed supply in a day, who was never supposed to be delivered to her farm, was greeting her horses with more kindness than she had seen in years. Maybe he was trained well, maybe he was naturally calm, or maybe he understood something she didn't. Even as she cleared out the largest stall for him, she kept watching the way he lowered his massive head toward each miniature horse like they were precious, breakable treasures. When she finally let him inside the cramped stall, he ducked under the low doorway without complaint, though he barely had space to turn around. Margaret rushed back to the farmhouse to call the transport company and fix the mistake. But every call went to voicemail. When she finally reached someone in customer service, the news made her knees weaken. No driver could return for 5 days. 5 long days, with a horse who needed space she didn't have and food she couldn't afford. When she returned to the barn, she found him standing quietly at his stall door, gazing down at the 3 rescue foals in the stall beside him. Tiny, fragile babies who feared everything, except him. The smallest foal stretched up on her hind legs, trying to reach his nose. The giant gelding lowered his head until they nearly touched. Margaret froze. A moment later, the foal nickered, soft, trusting, safe. And the gentle giant answered her with a sound so warm and deep, it filled the small barn like a heartbeat. Margaret's breath trembled. Something extraordinary was happening. The next morning, Margaret hurried into the barn before the sun had fully risen. She expected to find the foals in their own stall, shivering from another restless night. Instead, she froze in the aisle, unable to believe what she saw. The giant Clydesdale was lying down in his cramped stall, and all 3 miniature foals were curled against him. Midnight rested her tiny head on his massive shoulder. Rusty slept curled against his front legs. Goldie had tucked herself into the curve of his belly. The gelding lay motionless, careful not to shift even an inch. His breath rose and fell like a slow, steady tide, and with every rise, the foals lifted gently with him. Margaret clutched the stall door, her heart swelling. These babies had been terrified of everything and everyone since arriving. They never relaxed. They never slept deeply. They flinched from every sound. But here, wrapped against a horse who could crush them by accident, they slept like they were finally safe. He wasn't just big. He wasn't just gentle. He was a comfort they had never known. Later that morning, she placed the foals and the draft horse in her quarantine paddock, since it was the only enclosure tall enough to hold him. The space was small for a horse of his size, but he stayed calm, grazing with quiet patience. The foals followed him in a perfect line. When he stepped forward, they stepped forward. When he stopped to watch birds fly overhead, they froze beside him. They copied everything he did. Margaret stood near the fence, watching Rusty rear playfully against Murphy's leg. The giant gelding never moved more than an inch. He didn't even twitch. He simply lowered his head and blew a warm breath that sent the little colt into a joyful bucking fit. When Dr. Radford stopped by to check another horse, she leaned on the fence rail and shook her head in amazement. "He's acting like their guardian," the vet said. "Look at them. They're using him the way foals use a mother horse. He's showing them the world is safe." Margaret watched as Midnight ran in a wobbly circle around him. When she tripped in the grass, Murphy lowered his head and nudged her gently to her feet. She squealed with delight, shaking off the stumble, then ran again. "They trust him," Margaret whispered. "I've been trying for weeks, and he did it in a day." "He's something special," the vet agreed. "I've seen horses with good temperaments, but this is rare. He's healing them." But the peaceful moment vanished the next morning when the transport company called. "We have a driver available," the woman said. "He'll pick up the draft horse tomorrow morning at 9. Quote, Margaret felt her stomach twist. Of course this was the right thing. The Clydesdale didn't belong here. Someone at Windridge Ranch was waiting for him. The foals needed him, but she had no money, no space, no way to keep him. Still, she nodded, even though no one could see her. "Tomorrow is fine." But nothing felt fine afterward. That night, she walked out to the paddock. The foals were huddled under Murphy's neck, their tiny bodies pressed against him as if trying to hold on to the safety he gave them. They drifted to sleep like that every night, wrapped in warmth and trust. As Margaret watched, Murphy lifted his head and looked at her with quiet understanding, as if he already knew he was leaving. "I'm sorry, big fellow," she whispered. "I don't want you to go." The next morning came too quickly. The truck pulled into the driveway. A different driver climbed down, older and more confident. He looked at the giant gelding with approval. "Fine horse," he said. "Windridge will be glad to get him back." But when Margaret led Murphy toward the trailer, the foals began to panic. Midnight reared up at her stall door, crying out in a sharp, terrified whinny. Rusty paced in frantic circles. Goldie threw her head and called again and again, her voice shaking. Murphy stopped walking. He turned back toward them and let out a deep, rolling call that filled the entire barn with warmth. The foals answered immediately, desperate and afraid. The driver tugged on the lead rope. "Come on, big guy, time to go." But Murphy didn't move. His hooves stayed planted, heavy as anchors. His eyes stayed fixed on the babies who needed him. The foals cried even harder. Midnight pushed her tiny nose through the bars, calling for him in a voice that broke Margaret's heart. "He won't load," she told the driver. "Not while they're like this. Ma'am, I've got a schedule. Just give me a minute." She opened the foals' stall door. All three rushed down the aisle toward Murphy, pressing their heads against his legs, calling, shaking, begging him not to leave. Murphy lowered his head and touched each foal gently, calming them, giving them comfort that only he seemed able to give. Margaret watched with tears stinging her eyes. This wasn't a mistake anymore. This was a bond. With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone and dialed Windridge Ranch. When a man answered, his gruff voice filled her ear. "Windridge Ranch," Kurt speaking. "Sir," Margaret said, voice trembling, "I think we have each other's horses." "Oh yeah," he said with a chuckle. "Little Palomino gelding? My daughter has him sleeping on a blanket in her room." "Despite everything," Margaret laughed. Then her voice grew small. "You're Clydesdale. He's helped my foals." "They trust him. They need him. I know he's valuable, but would you consider selling him?" There was a long pause. "How much you offering?" I can't. I run a rescue. I don't have money." "Well," Kurt said, "what's he worth to you?" "Everything," she whispered. "He's worth everything to those babies." More silence. Then muffled voices. Then Kurt returned. "My daughter loves that little Minnie. Been begging for one for years. How about a trade, straight across? No money." Margaret's knees went weak. Yes, I accept." Quote. And just like that, the mistake became a miracle. When the truck left empty, Margaret led the giant gelding back to the barn. The foals raced beside him, squealing with joy. Midnight even bucked so high she almost fell over. Murphy lowered his head and breathed softly over each of them. He was home. The days that followed felt like sunlight returning after a long winter. For the first time since the foals arrived at tiny Hooves Farm, the barn was filled with happy sounds instead of frightened ones. Midnight no longer trembled at feeding time. Rusty no longer hid in the back corner. Goldie no longer flinched at every new noise. Wherever Murphy went, the foals followed. His presence had become their safety, their comfort, their whole world. Margaret found herself smiling more than she had in months as she watched them grow stronger. Murphy stood tall and patient while the foals explored the paddock around him. Midnight liked to stand between his front legs, as if she believed that was her safest place. Rusty loved to rear up against his shoulder, trying to be as big as Murphy but looking more like a playful kitten than a horse. Goldie followed him with complete devotion, mimicking the way he moved his head and copying every step. Every morning, Margaret stepped outside to find the same peaceful sight. Murphy lay stretched out in the soft grass, and the three foals were curled against him like little birds resting under the shelter of a giant wing. Sometimes Midnight slept directly on his neck, her tiny chest rising and falling with his breath. He never shifted until they were awake. He never disturbed them. He behaved as if their comfort mattered more than his own. The story of the gentle giant began spreading quickly. Margaret posted a picture of Murphy with all three foals sleeping against him, and the photo traveled far beyond her small town. Within days, thousands of people began following her farm online. Messages poured in from all over the country. People wanted to know the story of the giant who saved the tiny. Donations arrived in the mail. Some sent blankets, some sent feed. Others sent thank you letters, saying the story made them believe in kindness again. A local feed store offered to sponsor Murphy's food for a full year. A farrier who specialized in draft horses volunteered to trim his huge hooves at no cost. Even the lumber yard donated materials so Margaret could build a proper shelter tall enough for him. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't carrying the weight of her rescue alone. By the third month, the foals had transformed. Their ribs no longer showed. Their coats glowed, their eyes sparkled with curiosity instead of fear. They grew strong enough to run around the pasture in wild, happy circles. Murphy always stood in the center, watching them with the calm attention of a seasoned guardian. If one tripped or cried out, he was there in seconds, lowering his head to nudge them up again. Dr. Radford, who had been following their progress closely, came by often. One afternoon, she leaned on the fence and watched Murphy graze while the foals played under his belly. "What he's providing them," she said, "is something we usually only see with a good mother mare. He's giving them emotional security. He's teaching them confidence. He's helping their minds heal. Without him, these foals might have grown into anxious, unpredictable horses. Instead, they're going to have strong, balanced futures." Margaret nodded as she watched the trio trot proudly in a line behind Murphy. "He's changed this farm," she said quietly, "and he's changed me." 6 months after the mix-up, a letter arrived from Windridge Ranch. Inside was a photo of Kurt's daughter hugging the little Palomino miniature horse she had named Butterscotch. Both of them were smiling. The letter said, "Margaret, thank you for the trade. My daughter sleeps in the barn on weekends now because she refuses to miss a single morning with Butterscotch. He's changed her life. I hope Murphy is doing the same for yours. Sometimes the best things come from mistakes. Kurt." Margaret pinned the letter above her desk, then went outside. Murphy lifted his massive head at the sound of her boots, letting out a greeting that rolled across the field like thunder softened by love. Midnight raced toward her first, followed by Rusty and Goldie. They circled her legs before running back to Murphy, as if showing her who had taught them bravery. Margaret walked to the gentle giant, placing a hand on his warm shoulder. She still had to stretch her arm high just to reach him. "We're lucky you came here," she said. "Lucky that truck got lost. Lucky that mistake brought you to us." Murphy blew a soft breath into her hair and lowered his head until it rested lightly against her chest. The foals gathered at his feet, settling down as if this moment belonged to all of them. For a long time, Margaret stood there in the evening light, surrounded by the horses she had dedicated her life to saving. It didn't matter that her farm was small. It didn't matter that she worked off a pension and donations. What mattered was this peaceful herd, this unlikely family, this gentle giant who had arrived by accident but stayed by choice. Tiny Hooves Farm had always been a place for second chances. But Murphy reminded Margaret of something she had forgotten. Sometimes the best things in life are the ones you never plan for. Sometimes a mistake becomes a miracle. And sometimes the biggest heart on the farm belongs to the biggest horse.